Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Widow's Second Chance by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. 10th January 1892, 5 Points, New York. The wind howled through the streets as if screaming at her to walk faster. She walked as fast as she could, trying to avoid the mounds of snow against the buildings and the ice-cold mud on the road. Her coat did little to protect her against the icy gale that swept through the streets of 5 Points, but she simply couldn't afford a new coat. Eva Oliver held the bag of groceries close to her chest as she neared the building of tenement apartments where she lived. Her children would be waiting for her, and she was running a little late. They would worry, especially Mark. Although he was only 9 years old, he had taken on the role of Eva's protector and head of the household. Eva admired his courage, but she wished that he could just be a little boy again, a boy without the burden of looking out for his mother. But just like his father, Mark was eager to take up the responsibility. As a seamstress at one of the factories, Eva was grateful for the money. But between the long hours and the meager wages, she often worried about the future. She barely made enough to feed her children, and again she had fallen behind on the rent. There had been a time when paying her rent on time went without so much as a second thought, but that was before Peter passed away. A sigh escaped Eva as she began to ascend the steps to the 3rd floor. The hallways were ice cold, reminding her that winter hadn't played itself out just yet. When she reached her tenement, she opened the door with one hand while balancing the groceries in her other. She was barely through the door before Mark raced to meet her. "Where have you been, Ma? You're late. I was worried," Mark asked with concern. "I had to stop by the store before coming home, and Mr. Donald kept us late at work," Eva explained as she packed out what little food she could afford on her wages. A loaf of bread, a tiny block of cheese, and a few ounces of stewing beef compiled the contents of the bag. "It's all right. I took care of Carla and Henry when Mrs. Forstow had to leave," Mark explained. Mrs. Forstow was an elderly widow who lived 2 doors down. After Peter's accident, she offered to help Eva with minding the children while she was away at work. It was another expense Eva couldn't afford, but she needed to work. "Good, that's good," Eva said before she set about cooking their dinner. It would be stew again tonight, but at least tonight it would have some meat. Meat had become a luxury that Eva couldn't afford, but it was a luxury she had to buy every now and then, keeping in mind she had 3 growing children. "I'm cold," Carla complained from the threadbare armchair. She was wrapped in a blanket, but her rosy pink cheeks revealed what Eva already knew. Fuel for heating was something that she couldn't afford. Her landlord, Hector Levinson, would not be pleased to see a well-heated home when he visited to see about the overdue rent. "Come, sit here by the stove while I cook. It will warm you up quickly." Eva gestured for Carla to come closer. She stoked the coal stove until she could see the coals glowing red with heat before she began to cook. It was on nights like this that Eva felt hopeless about the future. There had been a time when she had the whole world at her feet and her soulmate at her side. But that had all quickly changed a little over 3 years ago. It had been a normal day, or at least it had started that way. Eva had said goodbye to Peter at the door before he left for work. Peter had worked as a banker in the decent part of town and had earned a very respectable salary. She had been a little over 6 months pregnant with Henry and had spent the morning playing with Carla and Mark. Procent. Back then, she didn't have to concern herself with such things as work or getting the rent paid. Late that afternoon, a man had come to her door. Eva had known something was awry before he even uttered the first word. She could see it in his eyes. There had been a carriage accident that morning. A horse had been spooked and overturned its carriage. It had been Peter's bad luck that had put him on the side of the road on which the carriage had toppled. The bystanders had rushed him to the doctor, but after an hour of quiet suffering, He passed away with the doctor by his side. Gone was the love of her life, her protector, and the father of her children. Eva had wept inconsolably for days, until the lawyers had come to see her. She and Peter had no debt, but without his wages, she couldn't afford their little house or the luxury of the role of full-time mother. Eva had no choice but to distance herself from her grief and focus on building a new life without Peter. She and the children had moved to the tenement in 5 Points, a long way from the safe apartment they shared before. She had found work as a seamstress in a factory, and now worked 12-hour days while she paid someone else to take care of her children. The life she led now was nothing like the life she had once imagined. A knock at the door brought her back to reality. Eva was about to answer the knock when Mark pushed through to reach it first. "Well, hello there, young Mr. Oliver. Is your mother home?" Hector Levinson's voice propelled Eva all the quicker towards the door. "Good evening, Mr. Levinson." Eva greeted him with a friendly smile. "How are you?" "Better than you, I presume," Levinson said, chewing on his tobacco. "Cold in here, ain't it?" "I know I'm behind on the rent. I'm doing my best to pay you as soon as possible," Eva all but pleaded. Levinson shrugged. "A debt due is a debt due." His smile curved salaciously. "But of course, there is a way you can pay the debt tonight. I'll even throw in a bucket of coal for the fire. It's a way for your family to sleep as cozy as a baby bear." Eva took a step back, horrified at the suggestion. "I'll try to get you your money before the end of the week." "Might freeze before then, Levinson smirked. "A single night could wipe your debt clean and have you heat for the rest of the month?" "What you say?" Levinson's hand snaked out and caught Eva by the arm. "Ouch, let go of me, you're hurting me." Eva thrashed her arm loose, but Levinson wouldn't release his grip. Quite unexpectedly, the broomstick slammed seemingly from nowhere across Levinson's arm. "Let go of my ma." Levinson dropped Eva's arm like a hot potato before he turned on Mark with anger blazing hot in his eyes. "You little," Eva stepped between Levinson and her son. "As I said, I'll try my best to have the money to you by the end of the week. We'll be fine without the heat." There was steel in her voice, although there was fear in her heart. "Watch yourself, boy. You're not too old for a good beating," Levinson snapped. Eva's heart coiled with fear, but she didn't dare let it show. She waited until Levinson was out of the door before she turned to Mark. "What were you thinking? He could have thrown us out on the street." Mark shrugged, not looking regretful at all. "He was hurting you, Ma, and it's my place to protect you." "No, Mark, it's my place to protect you. And when you commit such brave but foolish acts, you put both of us in danger. I can handle Mr. Levinson, you hear me?" Eva said sternly before she pulled Mark close for a hug. "Thank you for trying to protect me, but I can take care of myself." Eva hated that her life had come to this. A landlord with lewd suggestions, a 9-year-old trying to defend her honor, and her daughter Carla looking at them in horror. Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't dare let them fall. Not now, not in front of the children. But when she turned into night, when the apartment was quiet and the children fast asleep, she would weep for everything she couldn't do or afford for her children. Chapter 2. 10th of January, 1892, 5 Points, New York. "Thank you so much for taking care of them today. Mrs. Forstow really has terrible flu," Eva said as she walked through the door of the apartment. Belinda Thomas, her longtime friend, had come all the way from her more affluent neighborhood to help take care of the children for the day. Mrs. Forstow's flu had already cost Eva 2 days' wages, and she wasn't sure how much longer she would be off her feet. When Eva had traveled uptown yesterday with the children to plead with her childhood friend for help, Belinda hadn't hesitated. "It's only a pleasure. They were like little angels. I hardly knew they were here." Belinda smiled warmly. "You had them on a good day," Eva teased as she greeted her children. "Perhaps, but I don't mind helping out. I'll come and take care of them until Mrs. Forstow is better." Belinda promised. Eva wanted to weep with gratitude. She needed her wages, and Mr. Donald at the factory had a firm rule about no work, no pay. "At least let me thank you in some way." "You can make me tea," Belinda suggested warmly. Eva set about brewing a fresh pot of tea while she listened to Mark and Carla tell her about their day. Mark, at the age of 9, was eager to read, whereas Carla, only 6 years old, was only beginning to learn the alphabet. Henry, who was only 3, spent his day exploring the small tenement apartment between naps and bouts of mischief. A short while later, the children were occupying themselves while Eva and Belinda enjoyed a cup of tea. "You look tired," Belinda commented without criticism. Eva nodded. "I am, but I have to work longer hours to pay Mr. Levinson," Eva explained. "Mark told me what he did, brave little boy that," Belinda said with a proud smile. "Brave and foolish," Eva shook her head. "I just can't seem to stay ahead with the rent along with all the other expenses. Every week I have to decide what gets priority. The rent, Mrs. Forstow, or food. Or clothes." Belinda sighed in sympathy. "Your coat is threadbare, you must be freezing." "I'll be fine," Eva insisted. "I'll bring you one of mine tomorrow." "I don't need your charity, Belinda. You've always been a good friend. The last thing I want is your pity," Eva argued. "It's not charity or pity, it's a loan." Belinda shrugged. "Here, I brought you this. It's a way for you to find a way out of this situation." Belinda glanced around the tiny apartment. "Before you tell me no, just hear me out. You've been struggling to make ends meet for 3 years. Your fire hasn't been used for months, and your children need new clothes. Unless you take a chance or find a very lucrative job, which we both know isn't going to happen since you're a woman, you need to take this seriously." Eva glanced down at the matrimonial times and shook her head. "No, I am not a young girl dreaming of an adventure in the West. No, you're the mother of 3 children in desperate need of a change in your life. At least look at it, Eva. It can't do any harm to at least consider it." Eva chuckled. "What type of man will take in a widow with her 3 children?" "A good man, or at least that's what I'm hoping for," Belinda said with a look of promise. "I've got to go, but please, Eva, promise me you'll write to at least one gentleman." After all Belinda had done for her over the years, Eva couldn't deny her that request. "Fine, but just one." Later that night, once the children were in bed, Eva reached for the matrimonial times. Almost every advertisement was for a young man seeking true love. Eva had passed the point of looking for love. She needed security. There were a few advertisements that looked slightly promising, but Eva simply couldn't choose just one. So instead, she did what Belinda had suggested and took a chance. She responded to 10. Every letter contained more or less the same wording, an honest reflection of her circumstances and what she hoped to find. "My name is Eva Oliver. I am a mother of 3 young children, aged 9, 6, and 3. I lost my husband, Peter, to a terrible carriage accident shortly before the birth of my youngest son. I can understand if you wish not to read further. I can't say that I can even blame you. I know that a widow with 3 young children is a heavy burden for any man to take on, even if he fathered those children. But I hope to find someone kind, caring, and generous enough to at least consider the prospect of taking in a ready-made young family. As a widow in New York, I have been struggling to make ends meet for the last 3 years. I have sacrificed time with my children to work at a garment factory for long hours each week. And yet, regardless of the long hours, the wages aren't enough to cover my rent and childcare or the basic necessities for my children. I do not ask for your charity or sympathy, simply for a chance to prove that I will be an asset to your life. I am a good cook and housekeeper. I work hard, I hardly ever complain, and as for the children, I'll make sure to have them steer clear of you at all times. I am simply hoping for an opportunity to give my children a better life. A life in which they will have a warm bed in which to sleep in during the winter months, where my eldest doesn't feel as if he's my sole protector. A life where they can once again be children. I expect you will not consider corresponding with me, but I beg of you to reconsider. I cannot promise you my heart as I have lost the love of my life, but I can promise you companionship, kindness, support, and most of all, I can promise you that I will earn our keep through hard work and perseverance." Her words smacked of desperation, but that was the way Eva felt. Whether or not she would receive a response was another matter altogether. She slipped the letters into envelopes and addressed them individually. She would mail them the following day with money she should have used to buy coal, but, hopefully, this would be her last winter suffering through the cold. Just perhaps God might bless her with a man brave enough to take her and her children in. Chapter 3. 12th of March, 1892, 5 Points, New York. As the winter frost vanished and spring arrived, so Eva's hope for finding a husband out west disappeared. With Belinda's help, she had managed to put in a few extra shifts over weekends at the factory to earn enough to bring her rent up to date. She didn't want Hector Levinson to have an excuse to come knocking again. If he made another lewd suggestion about how she could pay her rent, it might lead to more than just Mark striking him with a broom. Mrs. Forstow was back to her usual miserable self, but at least she was in good health and could look after the children during the weekdays. She complained whenever Eva saw her about her children simply breathing too loud. But as for childcare, Eva was left with no options. The sun was already hiding behind the tall factories when Eva began her walk home. She couldn't help but be grateful that winter was behind them. There had been a few nights that Eva had no choice but to dress her children in all their clothes while they all huddled beneath blankets to stay warm. The more pleasant weather of spring might bring a reprieve, but after spring came summer, and after summer the temperatures would plummet once again. Eva let out a heavy sigh. She was tired of worrying about putting food on the table and money for rent, and worst of all, that something might befall Mrs. Forstow, causing her to be unable to work at all. Belinda's suggestion about becoming a mail-order bride had given her a brief flicker of hope, one that had taken on a life of its own as Eva dreamed of an easier life in the West. But now she was angry for allowing herself to dream. It had been 2 months since she had mailed the 10 letters to 10 different men. Not a single one had responded. Eva couldn't blame them. Marrying a woman you didn't know was one thing, but marrying a stranger and accepting 3 young children was a lot for any man to take on. It was time for Eva to give up on that dream, to accept that her life would be hard and that her hours of labor would always be long. But with acceptance came anger. Anger at having been dealt this hand. She and Peter had such a good life. Why did the Lord have to snatch it away? Why did he have to call Peter home so soon? A tear slipped over Eva's cheek as she wondered if God even remembered her at all. Perhaps she was just another lonely widow struggling to make ends meet. Not every lonely widow could be blessed with a miracle from above, could they? She slowly climbed the stairs to her apartment, trying her best to summon a brave face. She couldn't let the children see her fear or catch on to how sad she was. She needed to be strong for their sake at least. "There you are, late again?" Mrs. Forstow grumbled when Eva stepped through the door. "I'm sorry, the boss kept us late," Eva apologized. Mrs. Forstow huffed under her breath as she headed to the door. "These children will be the end of me yet." The door closed behind her, and Eva wished she could afford a different minder. Belinda already helped her so much over the weekends, she couldn't impose on her for more days a week. But every time Eva stepped out the door, she felt guilty about subjecting her children to the miserable and mean Mrs. Forstow. "Ma, we got a letter today, all the way from Montana." Mark handed her a letter. "Do we know people in Montana?" "No," Eva answered, even as her heart began to race. She refused to let herself hope, but she couldn't contain her excitement as she opened the letter. "Dear Eva, I am sorry for taking so long to respond to your letter, but I had a lot to think about after learning of your husband's unfortunate accident and your 3 young children. Sepsement. My name is Samuel Pugh, almost 40 years of age, and I am a cattle rancher. When I placed the advertisement, I had unwittingly thought to attract a young woman who was yet to have children. I should be honest about receiving a good few of those letters, and yet none of them called to me like yours. I'm not sure if it was the brutal honesty of your letter and your situation or your fear for your children's future, but your words remained with me for weeks. Finally, I felt I had no choice but to pen you a letter. I have no family of my own, but I can imagine that 3 young children can be very demanding. After giving this matter much thought, I've finally decided to offer you a proposal of marriage. Of course, this will be a marriage of convenience for both of us, and not one of love. I seek companionship and someone to help around the house. whilst you seek a better future for your children. I can provide you with everything you and your young children might need if you're willing to brave the life of ranching in the West. I have to warn you that it can be an unforgiving life at times. The work is often more laborious than the work you are now accustomed to. The weather can be lovely one day and then batter you with wind and storms the next. You might wonder why I would ask for your hand given your background, so I'll explain it to you simply. Because you already have children, I believe you would not want to have more. Finding a wife who already has children of her own relieves me of the burden to provide her with more. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you take this letter to heart and think on it, as I had done with yours. Kind regards, Samuel Pugh. Eva read the letter once more to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. A first letter with an offer of marriage was not what she expected. She was sure that she might have read it incorrectly. When she finished it for the 10th time, she felt hope blossom in her chest. She was right. Samuel Pugh wasn't expecting a marriage of love and devotion, but rather a partnership and companionship. She glanced at Mark and Carla, who was waiting for her to say something, and knew that she had just received a blessing from above. She had no idea of the type of man Samuel Pugh might be, but she had to believe that he was kind and generous, or he wouldn't have been willing to marry her and accept responsibility for her brood. "Ma, who's it from?" Mark asked after a while. Eva drew in a deep breath. "A rancher in Montana. He's offered for us to live with him on his ranch." "A real ranch?" Mark asked, his eyes widening with excitement. "No more Mrs. Forstow?" Carla asked hopefully. Eva chuckled, feeling a little lighter than she had in years. "Yes, a real ranch, and yes, Carla, no more Mrs. Forstow." Eva scooped Henry up and blew raspberries on his belly until he laughed. "We might be going to live on a ranch, Henry." "Horsies?" Henry asked in his toddler language. "I think so, lots of horsies." Eva laughed as she twirled Henry in circles. Before she knew it, they were all doing a happy dance. Chapter 4. 19th of March, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Samuel rocked back and forth on his rocking chair, staring at the letter in his hand. He wasn't sure why he had thought it a good idea to propose marriage to a widow with 3 young children, but now that he knew he had to read her response to his proposal. He glanced out over the open plains he called home and wondered what it would be like to have a wife in the kitchen and children playing in the yard. He had long since let go of such fantasies, and now that it was within his reach, he found himself hesitant. Would he be a good father to her children? Would he be a kind husband and provider? Did he have the patience for 3 young children? He didn't expect a marriage of love, but the loneliness had caught him off guard more than once. Living on a large ranch with no one but his ranch hands for company had been enough for a very long time, until one day it wasn't. Samuel Pugh had never considered advertising himself like livestock in the matrimonial times, but after much prodding and pushing from his head ranch hand, he had finally given in. A little help around the house would be nice, and besides, the company of a lady would make his house feel like a home. But when it came to love, Samuel had no hopes of ever finding love. To Samuel, love was like a mythical creature found only in books, something heard about but never witnessed for yourself. He had no expectations of experiencing it now, but perhaps in time he could come to care for Eva and perhaps even for her young children. If he was honest, it was the situation she had described that had tugged on his heartstrings. Why not offer her marriage and a home for her children? Wouldn't he be better suited to a widow with her children than a young girl with dreams of true love and the prospect of pregnancies? It was time to stop wondering about his motives for asking for Eva's hand, and time to read her response. Samuel carefully opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Samuel, I had all but given up hope when I received your letter. Needless to say, I was more than a little surprised by your offer. I understand the burden you are taking upon yourself by your proposal of marriage, and I want to express my sincerest gratitude. I hereby accept your proposal of marriage. My children and I are eager to travel to Montana to begin our new life on your ranch. After losing my husband, I never thought I would consider marriage again, But as you said, this will be a marriage of convenience. I am willing to help on the ranch in any way you require, and I will keep your home in an acceptable fashion at all times. I am willing to learn any new skills you require of me. I can sew and mend clothes, curtains, and any other garments you require, and I will cook your meals every day. I will make sure the children are never in your way, and I can assure you that they are well behaved. Once again, Samuel, I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to leave the horrors of life in New York. I have heard rumors about the unforgiving West, but I can assure you, New York is just as unforgiving of a woman caring for 3 young children. I look forward to hearing from you before I make arrangements for our travel westward. Kind regards. Eva. Samuel frowned at the letter. As he read her acceptance, he felt a spark of hope and excitement in his heart. However, the further he read, the more he realized that Eva was so grateful to be offered an opportunity to leave New York that she was willing to work her fingers to the bone. He didn't expect that. As for her children being underfoot, children were underfoot. That was the way of it. He didn't expect her to hide her children away whenever he was around. In fact, he looked forward to getting to know them. Perhaps the wording of his letter to her had led to miscommunication with regard to his expectations of her, but he wanted to set that right before her arrival. He didn't expect her to be grateful to him for the rest of her life, or to prove herself to him every day through her labor. It was then that Samuel realized that although he was offering Eva a chance at a new life, she was more desperate than he had realized. She had to be resilient to have managed over the last 3 years, and hardworking to have worked the hours she mentioned. Samuel didn't just want to offer her a reprieve. He wanted to really help her. He wanted her to feel as if she could breathe again, because it was clear, from her letters, that Eva hadn't been able to breathe a steady, calming breath since losing her husband. Samuel gathered his writing material and began his response to her letter. Dear Eva, I am overjoyed with your acceptance of my proposal. Please find enclosed in this envelope enough money to cover your train fare as well as any costs you might encounter on your journey. Telegram me the date of your arrival, and I will be sure to meet you and your family at the station. Before you travel west, I want you to understand that I am not taking you in as a servant of any kind. Of course, certain chores will be appreciated, but the last thing I want is for you to work the hours you have been in New York. The presence of you and your children on the ranch excites me. I cannot imagine that they will be underfoot in any way. Children are meant to be curious, busy as worker ants, and hungry as bears after hibernating for the winter. Please do not feel the need to keep them from me or to apologize for them. Lastly, I do hope that you too are looking forward to coming west. I find you to be honest, direct, and very strong-willed. 3 qualities you will need in the West. 3 qualities I admire in a woman. I look forward to meeting you and your children and to starting our new lives together. I will make arrangements for us to be wed on your arrival so as not to tarnish your reputation before we return home to the ranch. My sincerest regards. Samuel read over the words once more and felt pleased with the tone and directness. He wanted to make sure that Eva understood that he was welcoming her and her children, and that perhaps in time, her children might grow fond of him. Samuel had always loved children and already knew that he would grow fond of them without question. As for Eva, he wasn't sure if love was on the cards, but perhaps mutual understanding and respect were worth more than a passing flirtation. Chapter 5. 26th of March, 1892, 5 Points, New York. Eva held Henry on her hip while holding Carla's hand, who in turn hung onto Mark's hand. The train station in New York was busier than Eva had ever imagined. She felt anxiety pool in her belly that one of her children would be snatched or that one of their trunks would be left behind. Eva, breathe, Belinda encouraged with a smile. I'm not sure about this. Eva shook her head. What was I thinking? I don't know this man. Now I'm traveling to the other side of the country to marry him. It was ridiculous. Come on, Belinda. Help me with the trunks. I'm not going anywhere. Belinda stepped forward and framed Eva's face with both her hands. Eva, breathe. you're just a little overwhelmed. Heaven knows you've barely slept since he sent you money for the train fare. You're making a well-thought-through decision for your family, one that will benefit both you and the children. Gone are the long hours at the factory, Mrs. Forstow's complaining, and that terrible apartment you called home. You're doing the right thing, I'm sure of it. How do you know? Eva asked on the verge of tears. She lowered her voice as she searched Belinda's gaze. It feels like I'm betraying Peter. It feels like I'm betraying his memory, our vows. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's how I feel. What if I'm making a mistake? Belinda pulled Eva in for a hug before she smiled warmly at her friend. Because if you're making a mistake, you wouldn't have been here. Because if you were making a mistake, God wouldn't have found a kind and generous man to take you in. Where's your faith, Eva? You've prayed on this for weeks on end. I am certain of it that this is your fate. This is where God is leading you. All you need to do is to be brave one more time and board that train. Eva drew in a deep breath and looked at their luggage. Her whole world was packed into a few small trunks and carpet bags. She closed her eyes and pushed away the noise of the train terminal and instead focused her mind on her decision. Belinda was right. She had thought this through. This was the best decision she could make for her family. Sure, she couldn't be sure what waited for them in Montana, but she knew in her heart it was going to be better than a cold tenement apartment and a life where she worked so many hours she hardly ever saw her children. She felt a calm wash over her and opened her eyes with a smile curving her mouth. You're right. I am doing the right thing. Now wish me farewell before I change my mind. Belinda's laughter rang in the air as she smacked kisses on the children's foreheads. You behave on the train now, you hear. And as for you, she held Eva's gaze. Open your heart, Eva. You're young and you have eternity ahead of you. Open your heart to the possibility of love. Perhaps not today or tomorrow, but one day, you might find that this rancher is more than just your husband of convenience. He might be your second chance at love. Eva laughed and shook her head. I doubt that very much, but thank you for your confidence. Good, now go. I'll send the telegram to Samuel to tell him you're on your way. After a few more hugs and kisses, Eva and her children boarded the train. Samuel had sent enough money for them to travel first class. There were even 2 berths for the children to sleep in. Eva didn't for a moment believe that her future husband was wealthy, but it did ease her mind to know that he could afford such extravagant travel accommodations. It wasn't long before the whistle sounded on the train and the wheels began to move. Eva waved to Belinda one last time, wondering if she would ever see her good friend again. Although her heart ached to say goodbye, it swelled with hope to say hello to a new future and new part of the country. Chapter 6, 27th of March, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. You want to fix up this old place? John Shortbrook rubbed his beard whilst giving Samuel a curious look. Samuel nodded as he took in the old abandoned house. Yep, you got a problem helping me with it? John shrugged. I get paid whether I have an opinion or not. Just wondering why you're interested in fixing it up nice and pretty now. The cabin never bothered you before. Samuel turned to his head ranch hand and wished that sometimes John wasn't so outspoken. For the last 7 years, John had been his right hand on the ranch, and over time they had become more friends than just employer and employee. But there were times like now that Samuel wished John didn't have to voice his every doubt, especially when those doubts mirrored the ones residing in Samuel's mind. If you're done wondering, think we can start? Samuel asked a little irritably. John nodded. How long before they get here? 6 days till the train pulls into the station. Think it's enough time? Samuel asked as he and John circled the old house. Might be enough, depending on what you have in mind. We need them new shutters. Then there's the porch that needs fixin'. The roof's probably leaking like a faucet and we'll have summer rains soon. How about the inside? How much work you want done there? Samuel drew in a deep breath as they ascended the porch. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as if reminding Samuel of their age and how much weathering they had seen. Let's take a look. He carefully pushed the door open. He paused inside and glanced around the empty space. Why'd you never live here? Seems to me like a pretty nice place, John asked, moving through the open living area. Too much space for one man, Samuel grumbled. John didn't argue, but instead inspected the rest of the house. Got 4 bedrooms and a fireplace in the main bedroom. Quite a treat, I'd say. We need to make sure the chimneys are working. Check the floorboards and underneath the house for snakes or pests, Samuel thought out loud. If you don't need the men to do anything but check in fences over the next few days, I'd say we can manage it. We've got some lumber behind the barn we haven't used, and some nails as well. We can start today, John said, sounding almost pleased at the idea of constructive work. Thank you, John. That will be great. We'll probably need to put up a clothesline as well, Samuel mused as they walked out of the house. John nodded. And then you'll probably want us to cart everything from the cabin all the way up here? He let out a quiet sigh at the thought of all the heavy lifting. Got a pretty view, ain't it? Samuel nodded. That it does. Well, this place ain't going to be ready in time for your bride if we don't start. You can take in the view when we're done. John headed to his horse and heaved himself into the saddle. John, before you go, send a few men this way to get started, and then send 2 more to town. I've got some furniture they've been keeping in storage for me at the livery. Take a couple of men and go fetch it, won't ya? John's eyes widened with surprise. After 5 years, I thought there ain't nothing I didn't know about you, Samuel, only to learn you have a secret storage stable of fancy furniture. Seems to me this filly is already bringing out a side of you I ain't never seen before. Yeah, go on. Samuel shook his head. There was a lot John didn't know about him, but some things you simply didn't talk about. Sometimes it was best if the past was simply that, the past. Pro 7%. Samuel turned back to the old ranch house and imagined what it would look like in all its glory. The cabin had always been more than enough for him, although it had been meant as lodgings for the head ranch hand. Now that he had a family to consider, it was time to move out of the cabin and into a home that could house a family. He could put up a little fence so the little ones didn't run off when you weren't looking. He could even tie a swing rope to the old sycamore tree that stood a little ways from the house. A smile curved Samuel's mouth as excitement began to build in his mind. Perhaps it was time John finally moved into the cabin meant for the head ranch hand, and time for Samuel to finally have a family and start looking toward the future. Chapter 7. 3rd of April, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Eva's hands were clammy and nervous sweat beaded her forehead as the train came to a stop. Ever since boarding the train in New York, her doubts about traveling west with 3 young children had surfaced. Except for the nightmare it had been to have them cooped up on a train for days on end, there was the constant fear of train robbers, being derailed, or even worse, a flash flood or avalanche. Eva knew that most of her fears were unfounded, but that didn't mean they did not feel real to her. She was overjoyed that they had finally reached their destination, all safe and sound. But now that they had finally arrived in Oak Creek, it meant that it was time for her to say her vows to a man she had never even met. She couldn't help but regret that she hadn't spent more time corresponding with Samuel before accepting his proposal. Perhaps if she knew a little more about him, about what he enjoyed and his dislikes, she wouldn't feel so excruciatingly nervous now. Her heart raced a mile a minute as she gathered her children and headed for the platform. Mark walked ahead of her, holding on to Carla's hand. Eva had Henry on her hip as it was easier than running after him every time he was distracted. They finally disembarked and drew their first breath of Montana air. "Ma, why is it so dirty?" Mark asked her with a horrified expression. Eva couldn't help but laugh. "It's not dirty, it's dusty. See those wide-open plains? When the wind sweeps through, it picks up all that dirt and dust and drops it when it's done blowing." Mark shrugged. "If it picks up dirt, then it's dirty." Eva didn't have time to explain the difference between dirty and dusty right now, and she didn't have the energy to explain to her son that no one was going to sweep the west of a little dust. Instead, she glanced at the conductor who understood what she was looking for. "Your luggage is on the last carriage, ma'am. You can just head in that direction." Eva and her children walked along the platform in the direction of a tall man already unloading their luggage. Suddenly, their luggage seemed even less substantial than it had in New York. How was it possible that an entire lifetime of memories and belongings could be packed into so few trunks and carpet bags? Now that she had her luggage, Eva felt even more nervous than before. What if Samuel had changed his mind? What if she and her children were left stranded on a train platform in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Montana? Is that him, Ma? Mark asked, pointing his finger at a tall man walking in their direction. Mark, don't point. Eva trailed off as she followed her son's finger. The man walking towards her was tall, broad-shouldered, and as handsome as the light was bright. He had an easy gait on him and wore a boss of the plains hat. The only reason Eva knew the name of the hat was that almost every second man who boarded the train wore one. Some of them called it a Stetson after the company that made them. Eva, you must be Mark, and Carla, and this must be Henry? The handsome man asked, turning to each of them in turn. Eva was speechless for a moment. When Samuel had said he was 10 years her senior, she had for some reason imagined an older man, but the man in front of her was in the prime of his life. He looked strong, reliable, and trustworthy. Yes, I'm Eva Oliver, and these are my children. Samuel, it's nice to finally meet you. Samuel smiled warmly at her before turning to her children. All of you. You got a horse? Mark asked, cocking his hands on his hips. Samuel chuckled. Quite a few. Why? Care to learn how to ride one? Not if you're teaching me, Mark snapped. Healing. Eva quickly recognized her son's attitude. It was the same one he had with Hector Levinson. She turned to Samuel with an apologetic smile. Would you mind taking this trunk while I have a word with my son? Sure. Samuel lifted the trunk as if it weighed naught and hauled it to a wagon not far away. Eva lowered her gaze to meet Mark's and took him by the shoulders. Mark, I appreciate you looking out for me all these years, but that's over now. In a little while, Samuel and I will be married, and he will be my protector. Your only job will be to be a big brother and a little boy. Can you do that for me? Can you try not to offend Samuel again? Mark thought long and hard before he finally nodded. I'll try, Ma, but if he hurts you... He won't hurt me, Eva promised, hoping she was right. A short while later, they had loaded up all the luggage and were stopped in front of a small chapel. Are you ready? Samuel asked, turning to Eva. Eva drew in a deep breath before she exhaled on a chuckle. You're asking me? She glanced at her 3 children sitting on the back of the wagon. Are you ready? Samuel grinned at her with a shrug. Ready as I'll ever be. The pastor didn't waste their time with pretty words or long-winded sermons about marriage. Instead, the wedding ceremony was more official than it was romantic. Barely 20 minutes later, they were announced husband and wife and were handed a wedding certificate. It was so much different than the day Eva had married Peter, but she refused to think of that now. It was time for her to focus on her new life, a new future for her and her children. When everyone piled back into the wagon again, Samuel turned to them with a smile. Ready to go home? Oh no, not another train ride, Ma, Carla complained with a pout. Eva shook her head and smiled at her daughter. No, honey, not another train ride. Our new home is right here in Montana. Chapter 8. 3rd of April, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. There it is, your new home, Samuel announced as they neared the beautiful ranch house in the distance. I know it's not much, but at least it's got a pretty view. Eva felt her eyes pool with tears at the sight of the large house. It was larger than any house she had ever called home. It's simply beautiful, Samuel. Eva could already imagine what it would look like, with a small kitchen garden to one side, a little garden with a few blooms perhaps in the front. She couldn't wait to dig her fingers into the dirt and learn how to grow things. On the train from New York, she had met a lady who grew all her own vegetables. She had traveled east to visit her sister, but was more than a little excited to return to her homestead in Colorado. After spending time together on the train over the last few days, she had offered Eva some seeds as a parting gift. Would you mind if I plant a kitchen garden? Eva asked, turning to Samuel. She knew she should be more concerned with the chores Samuel needed her to do, but for a few moments, She allowed herself to indulge in her excitement. Samuel laughed. "If you want, that would be great. The well isn't far from the house, so you can water it all you want." "Wonderful. You hear that, children? We're going to plant a kitchen garden." "You want to bring dirt into the house?" Carla asked, horrified. "No." Eva shook her head. What was it with her children and dirt? "Outside, silly." "Henry, help," Henry said in his toddler dialect. "That's right, Henry. You can help." The wagon stopped in front of the porch, and Eva simply sighed at the sight of rocking chairs. What a luxury it would be to relax on the porch after a long day, instead of being cooped up in a small apartment. "Well, come on, hop off, and I'll give you the grand tour," Samuel said, plucking Henry from the back of the wagon and putting him on his feet. Eva froze, waiting for Henry's cries, but her youngest gurgled with laughter and snatched Samuel's hand instead. Mark glanced at Eva with confusion before he climbed out. Eva and Carla were the last to climb down. Eva took extra care, making sure she didn't embarrass herself by falling head over heels into the dirt. She wasn't accustomed to riding in wagons, but knew that in time she would manage to climb in and out with ease. "This is the porch," Samuel explained as he led them up the steps. Carla, Eva, and Mark followed close behind as Samuel opened the door with Henry still holding his hand. The moment the door opened, Henry pulled free and ran into the depths of the house. "Henry, come here!" Eva called after him. Samuel laughed. "Let him be. I checked for rattlers before I headed to the station." "He might break something or climb something, or," Eva began to argue, "or he might just stretch his legs after being cooped up in a train for days," Samuel finished for her. "Through here you've got the kitchen and the pantry. The wood stove has wood piled beside it, so no need to go out and fetch it. Then over there is the living room. The nights are still cold enough to light the fire every evening," Samuel continued, leading them through the house. "In here, I set up beds for the two boys. I hope they don't mind sharing?" Samuel stopped and turned to Eva with a questioning look. Eva shook her head, refusing to speak. Until now, they had all shared a one-room tenement apartment. Just the thought of having their own bed was an upgrade from sharing beds in New York. "Here you have the girls' room. I thought you wouldn't mind sharing with Carla." Samuel opened the door to the next room. There was a large vanity against one wall, flowery curtains, and two large beds. "This is our room?" Carla asked, rushing into the room before jumping onto the bed. "Ma, it's like a palace. And you're the princess," Eva managed with a tearful smile. "In here, you've got my room." Samuel opened the door and briefly showed her the main bedroom that had a fireplace of its own. There was one door left to be opened. Samuel led them to it and smiled at Eva before he opened the door. "And this is your ma's room. No one comes in here without her permission, you hear?" Samuel pretended to sound stern as he reached for the doorknob. Eva frowned. "But I thought you said Carla and I." Eva trailed off as her breath caught. Inside the last room was a large table boasting a sewing machine. An assortment of fabric was stacked on the table, from which there was a beautiful view of the yard through the window. "You said you were a seamstress, so I thought you might like somewhere to work." Samuel asked with a hesitant look. "Of course, I'm not expecting you to sew if you don't want to. I just thought." Eva turned to Samuel and threw her arms around his neck with excitement. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Realizing what she had done, she quickly stepped back and cleared her throat. "Thank you, I'm very grateful. And yes, I want to sew. I enjoy making the children's clothes." "I'm glad to hear it," Samuel said, sounding different. He stepped back and scratched his head. "You take your time and settle in. I've still got a few things I need to do." Just like that, he was gone. Eva and her children watched him walk out of the house and remove their luggage from the wagon. He climbed onto the wagon and set off in the direction from which they had come. For a moment, Eva was certain he regretted asking for her hand, but then she remembered her overeager display of gratitude. She hadn't meant anything by it, but perhaps it had been too forthcoming for Samuel. She quietly chastened herself before she turned to the children. "Come on, let's unpack." Chapter 9. 10th of April, 1892. Oak Creek, Montana. The first few days had been a little overwhelming. Apart from the fact that Samuel wasn't used to having young children around, there was the matter of having moved into the large ranch house. Unlike his cabin with everything only a few feet away, the larger house meant that the noise traveled, especially with little ones running around and crying out with laughter. Oh, but did that laughter bring him joy? Samuel had found more joy in the presence of Eva's children than he had imagined. They were well-mannered, energetic, and curious, just like any young mind should be. Now and then, if they dared to be a little unruly, Eva quickly set them back into place with a few firm words. From a distance, Samuel admired them. He wasn't sure how long it would be before he felt part of their family unit, if ever, but for now, just having them there made him feel alive and hopeful for the future. Gone were the lonely nights, the long silences between knocking off at sunset and joining the ranch hands at dawn, and gone was the need to have more than just a cabin to go home to. Instead, he was eager to return to the ranch house in the evenings, whereas previously he would have preferred working as late as possible to avoid the solitude of his cabin. The sun was descending quickly over the mountains when Samuel rode up to the ranch house. Although the barn and all the livestock were still kept a few hundred yards away at the cabin, he had built a lean-to for his steed to rest under at night. Of course, John had been overjoyed to move out of the bunkhouse and into the cabin. While he unsaddled his horse and put him to bed for the evening, Samuel could hear laughter coming from inside the house. It was evident from the noise that Carla and Mark were playing a game of hide and seek. Carla and Henry had quickly taken to his presence, but Mark was still very reserved. Only when he was spoken to would he talk to Samuel. Samuel didn't blame the little guy. He could imagine what a big adjustment the move must have been for him. Unlike Carla and Henry, Mark understood what marriage and forever meant. As he rounded the house, the aroma of a home-cooked meal reached him, making his mouth water. That was another thing he had yet to become accustomed to. Instead of the warm beans and grilled beef, Eva had treated him to a variety of hot, freshly cooked meals over the last week. Eva, Samuel stopped at the front door for a moment to think about his new wife. She was everything he had hoped for and more. She was kind, caring, and definitely a harder worker than she had promised. In just a week, she had scrubbed down the entire house and had made new curtains for the kitchen. The pantry had been reorganized, and all the children's rooms had been moved and arranged to their liking. It was as if the woman had a never-ending supply of energy. Then there was her smile. She had a smile that made Samuel forget about everything. A smile that made him dream of happy days and picnics on a sunny day. But for now, those smiles were reserved for her children. Samuel couldn't blame her. They barely knew each other. He let out a quiet sigh, wishing he had a way with words to learn more about her. But every time he spoke to her, he found himself second-guessing his choice of words, and instead of sounding interested, he seemed to be interrogating her. So for now, silence seemed the better option to go with. He stepped into the house and saw Eva in the kitchen with Henry on her hip. "Hello, you're back," Eva called over her shoulder. "Coffee. I just put on a fresh brew." "I've got you," Carla cried out with glee before her laughter bubbled into the air. "That's enough, you two. You can either go play outside or you can sweep the porch." Eva called to the children before offering Samuel a cup of coffee. "You always do that, don't you?" Samuel asked, accepting the cup of coffee. "What?" Eva asked, confused. "Here, you nibble on this." She handed Henry a piece of carrot. The toddler eagerly began to nibble at the carrot, clearly struggling with itchy jaws. "You give them a choice. Either they do something you want them to do, or they can do a chore," Samuel pointed out. "It's just easier than repeating myself over and over again." Eva shrugged. "Why, do you think it's wrong? Am I not firm enough?" There it is again, Samuel thought with an inward sigh. "No, I didn't mean to criticize you, I just noticed it. I think it's a great way to get them to do what you want." "Thank you." Eva turned and stirred something on the stove. "I see you've begun with the kitchen garden?" Samuel tried again. Eva quickly turned around with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, was there something else you wanted me to do first? I just thought it was such a lovely day, and to get the kids out of the house." "Why do you keep thinking I'm criticizing you?" Samuel asked impatiently. As soon as he said the words, he shook his head. I'm sorry if that came out rude. I don't know. It's just, Eva set Henry down to toddle around the kitchen before she met Samuel's gaze. You've done so much for us. I just don't want you to think I'm taking advantage. Samuel glanced around the house and couldn't help but chuckle. Have you looked around? I think I'm the one taking advantage. You've scrubbed down the entire house, polished the floors, organized the pantry, and you've done the laundry, all in 1 week. Eva's eyes widened. I only scrubbed down the house out of habit. It's not that I think it was dirty or anything, Samuel shrugged. That's not what I implied at all. It's just, you're already doing enough as it is. I appreciate everything you do, especially the meals. I'm glad you enjoy my cooking, Eva said quietly. Every time they talked, it was like this. Samuel couldn't help but feel frustrated with himself. He knew he was saying things the wrong way, but he wasn't sure how to talk to a woman anymore. He didn't want to offend her, but at the same time, he wanted to get to know her. But their conversations seemed awkward, stilted at best. Were they not compatible? Or was he simply not meant to be a husband? The doubts kept circling in his mind until he finally stood up. Call me when dinner is ready. I'll keep an eye on the kids outside. Samuel walked out of the house feeling like a fool. He had accepted that his marriage to Eva would be one of convenience, but right now it was nothing more than an awkward living arrangement. Unless he found a way to communicate with his wife, he wasn't sure this was ever going to work. He sat down in a rocking chair and pushed himself backward, allowing the chair to rock him back and forth. Whilst watching Carla and Mark play, he prayed for guidance and patience. He needed guidance to find a way to understand Eva, and guidance to reach an understanding so that they could at least be friends. And until then, he needed to be patient. Not only with Eva, but with himself. Chapter 10. 22nd of April, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Eva stood among the shelves of goods and let out a heavy sigh. At least when she had little to no money at all, she knew what she could and what she couldn't afford. With Samuel's vague instructions before dropping her off at the general merchant, Eva had no idea what he expected her to buy. He hadn't even given her money, so she had no idea if he expected her to pay for the purchases or if he would be back to pay for them. Eva didn't mind using the few pennies she had left on necessities like sugar and flour, but once again, she didn't know what Samuel expected. Just like the weather in this strange territory, Eva found her husband very hard to read. He hardly ever talked at all, and when he did, he seemed awkward. Eva wasn't sure if it was her or if he just had trouble communicating, but the more time she spent on Samuel's ranch, the more confused she felt. He thanked her for her efforts every day, but hardly ever talked to her about anything, like this morning. She had served everyone breakfast and had just finished cleaning the kitchen when Samuel had announced they were going into town. The drive into town had been long and quiet, with only the children bickering in the back of the wagon. Once they arrived in town, he stopped in front of the general merchant and told Eva to get everything they needed at home. He had offered to take the children with him to the feed store, giving Eva the freedom to browse the store without having to run after Henry or keep an eye on Mark and Carla. Eva glanced up and down the shelves and finally decided to only take what she could afford with the money in her purse. Samuel had never uttered a hard word in her direction, but she didn't want to cause a misunderstanding between them now by accepting that he was going to pay for her purchases. Eva reached for a small bag of flour and a pound of sugar before she headed to the next shelf. There she retrieved a bar of soap and a small bag of salt before she headed to the counter to pay. She paid for her purchases before heading out of the store and onto the boardwalk which lined the thoroughfare. Samuel and the children were coming towards her from the other side of town just as she stepped off the boardwalk. "Ma, we stopped by the livery and looked at Ponies," Carla announced excitedly. "The livery is next to the feed store," Samuel explained before a deep frown creased his brow. "Is that all we need?" he asked, glancing at her small bag of purchases. Eva shrugged. "It's the most necessary." A blush crept into her cheeks as she handed Samuel the bag before pulling herself up into the wagon. As soon as she was seated, Samuel turned to her with a curious look. "Did you pay for this?" Eva nodded. "I would have bought more, but—" Samuel softly cursed under his breath. "When I told you to buy what we needed, I meant anything you think we need or might need. I have an account. You can just tell Richard to put it on my bill." Eva let out an impatient sigh. "Maybe if you explained that to me before just dropping me off, I would have known." Samuel sighed and shook his head before meeting her gaze with a guilty expression. "I'm sorry, Eva. I should have explained. I'm sorry if you felt unsure. I didn't expect you to pay for these." "Well, I did," Eva snapped, wondering if she and her husband would ever be able to communicate without the tall barriers that seemed to be obstructing their words. Samuel climbed down from the wagon before he walked around and offered Eva his hand. "Eva, will you please accompany me to the general merchant? I would like your opinion on what we might need in the next 2 weeks until we come into town again. I don't want you to be scrupulous about cost, as I am paying for everything." Eva couldn't help the small smile from curving her mouth. "That's much better." She accepted Samuel's hand as she climbed down from the wagon. "Come on, kids. If you behave, you might even get some candy," Samuel called to the children. Mark helped Henry and Carla down from the back of the wagon before they followed Samuel and Eva into the general merchandiser. Samuel took 3 woven baskets from the front of the store. He handed one to Eva and another to Mark and kept one for himself. "Right, let's start at the canned goods." Samuel turned to Eva with an apologetic smile. "Load me up, Mrs. Pugh." Eva chuckled as she began loading baked beans and other canned goods into Samuel's basket. It was the first time that she felt at ease with Samuel. It was the first time that it didn't feel as if he were trying to avoid her. 3 baskets weren't near enough. Samuel insisted she take everything they needed, including scented oil for herself and a few unnecessary items, simply because Eva proved to be curious about them. By the time they had everything loaded onto the wagon, Samuel helped her up. "Was there anything else you needed in town? Perhaps you would like to stop at the garment store, or perhaps you would like to enjoy cake and tea at the hotel?" Eva's eyes widened. "Cake? Can we please—" "Mr. Pugh?" Mark called from the back of the wagon. Samuel's mouth curved into a smile as he reached for the reins. "Of course we can. It's not every day we come into town, is it? Tell you what, we'll make it a Pugh family tradition." Carla's giggles made everyone laugh. Samuel was in good spirits for the rest of the afternoon. He not only made Eva and her children laugh and feel spoiled beyond measure, but he actually met her gaze when he talked to her. After spending the last couple of weeks wondering if he wanted her and her children there at all, Eva was almost convinced that he liked them. When they arrived home, everyone helped carry in the purchases. While Eva packed the goods away, the children headed outside to play. Eager to keep up the good spirits, Eva turned to Samuel with a smile. "What would you like me to treat you with for dinner? You've already spoiled us so much today." Samuel shrugged. "Anything will be good. I've got to go check on a few things before dinner. I'll be back later." There it was, Eva thought. Gone was the connection they had briefly shared. As soon as he had set his feet back on the ranch, he was back to the distant man she had come to know and avoid over the last few weeks. Regardless of Samuel's distant manner, Eva decided she would make him a dinner worthy of the expenses he had undertaken today on their behalf. Chapter 11. 10th of May, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Eva sighed as she sat with Mark on the porch. Although Mark was an eager learner, he had a bit of trouble when it came to reading. Every day, Eva would spend time on lessons with Mark and Carla. But some days it was clear they'd rather be anywhere than sitting with her and learning new things. Coyote. Mark managed to pronounce it correctly at the moment the head ranch hand walked towards the house. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pugh. Mr. Pugh asked for you and the children to join him down at the barn." John Shortbrook smiled at her with a curious look. Over the last couple of weeks, what little interaction Eva had had with John had been pleasant. He seemed to be a hard worker and more than a friend to Samuel than an employee. "Now?" Eva asked, confused. "We're in the middle of our lessons," John shrugged. "I'm sure the children can catch up with their lessons tomorrow, ma'am." Eva wasn't sure what the hurry was. Samuel had never asked them to join him at the barn before. Of course, he'd taken the children there a few times, but Eva had only once been into the barn, and that was during the tour Samuel had given her of the ranch. Of course, Eva tried to hide her agitation. Samuel hardly ever spoke to her, and now he had stopped talking to her altogether, and instead sent his ranch hands to summon her. "Mark, Carla, put away your things. We'll continue tomorrow." Mark let out a quiet whoop, and Carla quickly gathered all the books on the table into a giant pile. "We're ready." "Put them inside," Eva sighed. She would deal with separating the subjects later. A short while later, they were walking towards the barn. Henry loved the freedom of running ahead, as he was mostly confined to the yard at the ranch house. Carla held on to Eva's hand and stayed with her while Mark rushed after his baby brother. "Do you know why Samuel wants us down at the barn?" Eva asked John, who was walking with them. John shrugged with a mysterious smile. "Can't say, although I can say the children might be very pleased." Even more baffled, Eva shook her head and continued to walk. When they rounded the barn, the first thing Eva saw was the two horses. They were tied to posts in front of the barn. She instinctively touched her hair, wondering if they had company she wasn't aware of. Samuel spotted her from where he was standing at a water trough giving instructions to a ranch hand. His mouth curved into a smile. "You came," Eva shrugged, trying not to appear agitated. "You summoned." "It's for a good cause," Samuel assured her. "Mark, Carla, come here." Mark and Carla rushed towards Samuel. Eva's heart warmed at the sight. Although she and Samuel seemed to have a little problem connecting, it was clear that he adored her children. Judging by the smiles on her children's faces, the feeling was mutual. "Now, before I say anything, I have to tell you that if your ma doesn't agree, her word is final." Samuel glanced at Eva over the children before turning back to the children. "Are you ready for your surprise?" "What surprise?" Mark asked eagerly. "You see them two ponies?" Samuel asked, nodding towards the two horses Eva had thought to belong to company. "If your ma agrees, they're yours. I'll teach you how to care for them, how to train them, and how to ride them, but only if your ma agrees." Eva's eyes widened with surprise. "You got them ponies?" "If you agree, then yep, I got them ponies." Samuel shrugged. Carla's squeals of delight sounded through the air. "Ma, please can we have 'em?" "Can we have them?" Eva correctly, instinctively. She glanced at Samuel and wondered how such a kind and generous mind could have so much affection for her children, but could hardly manage a conversation with her. She wouldn't deny the children the privilege of having their own ponies, but there would be conditions. "Yes, you can have them, but there are two conditions. Your lessons come first, and your chores don't fall behind," Eva said firmly. Mark and Carla's heads bobbed up and down with eagerness before they turned to Samuel. "Can we ride 'em? Please, can we ride 'em?" "Them," Eva muttered under her breath before a laugh escaped her at the pure joy on her children's faces. Samuel laughed as he scooped Carla up and deposited her on the lighter pony's back. "This one's yours. His name is Eli, and he's an old workhorse, so he'll be patient with you." "Hello, Eli. I'm Carla, and I love you." Carla cried out before hugging the horse. Eva's heart swelled at the way in which Samuel kept his hand on her knee to make sure she didn't slip. "And mine, what's his name?" Mark asked, walking towards the dark brown mare. "Her name is Patty. She's retired from the Pony Express. I promised her a good retirement on the ranch," Samuel explained. "Hey there, Patty. You're a pretty girl, aren't you?" Mark introduced himself as if to a new headmistress. As if deeming his introduction fit for a queen, Patty nickered with her head in the air. Samuel turned and looked at Eva. Her heart stilled for a moment as he held her gaze. She had always doubted that she would ever find love again, but perhaps she would find a different kind of love with Samuel. Appreciation and gratitude were feelings of love, too. When his mouth curved into a dashing smile, Eva's tummy flipped upside down. It was the first time she had experienced a bolt of attraction for her new husband. For the first time, there were no shadows in his eyes, and he wasn't reserved or holding back in some way. Across the children and their ponies, Eva felt hope spark in her heart. Perhaps in time, Samuel's defenses would crumble, and they would find a way to communicate without misunderstandings. Perhaps she might even fall in love with him. A light blush covered her cheeks. Eva was the first to break the gaze. She bent down and scooped Henry up, more to busy herself than for need, but she feared if she didn't, Samuel would see the hope in her eyes. Chapter 12. 24th of May, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. After a delicious dinner, Eva was putting the children to bed while Samuel sat pondering over his coffee. He'd been a little on edge all day and couldn't help but wonder if it was on account of his relationship with Eva. He really liked her, even admired her some. But except when the children were around to act as a buffer, he found himself tongue-tied. He knew why, but he couldn't seem to overcome the obstacles that were stopping him from connecting to his wife in the way he would like to. Over the last 6 weeks, he had come to know Eva as a caring mother and a kind wife. She didn't presume anything and never took more than what was offered. She worked harder around the house than most of his ranch hands and had turned the old neglected yard into something of a showpiece that was now neat and tidy, and even had some shoots sprouting from the ground. "They're down for the night. Would you like something else before I turn in?" Eva asked while she rinsed the last few cups. Every evening, Eva asked him this question, and every evening he said he was fine. He wondered what she would do if he said he'd like a pan of scrambled eggs and fresh bread. Curious about the extent of Eva's patience, Samuel's mouth curved into a smile. "I wouldn't mind some freshly baked bread." Eva paused for a moment before she nodded and started towards the pantry. Samuel couldn't help but laugh. "Eva, I was kidding." Eva turned to him with a confused expression. "You were?" "Yes. Heck, woman, what kind of man would expect you to bake him bread at this time of night? You need to learn to stand up for yourself," Samuel teased. Eva's mouth curved into a smile. "I never know when you're kidding," Samuel chuckled. "You'll learn. I don't expect you to do anything for me in the evenings, Eva. You do enough already." Eva walked towards him and stopped a few feet away. "You keep saying that, but I don't know how else to show my gratitude. Being here, on the ranch, it's changed our lives." Samuel felt his heart twist and turn. "It's changed mine, too." The moment lingered as if they were about to make a breakthrough when suddenly they were interrupted by a fervent knock on the door. "Samuel? Samuel!" Samuel frowned as he stood up at the sound of John Shortbrook's voice. "I'll be right back," Samuel said, heading for the door. He stepped out onto the porch instead of inviting John in. Whatever John had to say to him wasn't good news. He'd rather hear it in private before sharing it with Eva. "John, what's going on?" Samuel asked as soon as he closed the door behind him. John spat out his chewing tobacco before shaking his head. "Tom and Brady just came back from the saloon in town, words traveling about some cattle rustlers in the area." Samuel felt his head spin for a moment before he caught his footing and stabilized himself. "Word or evidence?" "Luke Skinner had a few head missing last week, and this week Tom Parker found some fences cut and 24 head missing from his herd," John explained in a heavy voice. "So it's not just word." Samuel shook his head as the heavy weight of fear settled on his shoulders. "No, it ain't. I'll make sure the hands are armed when they ride out, and we'll keep our eyes on the fences," John promised. "I wish there was more we could do," Samuel admitted ruefully as a dark black chasm grew in the pit of his stomach. "Right now, there ain't. You gonna tell the missus?" John asked, nodding towards the house. Samuel shook his head. As the head of his new family, he wouldn't saddle them with the burden of this news. He'd rather keep it to himself. "Prosody? No, you don't mention it to her either. We'll deal with the rustlers if they come, otherwise there ain't no reason to worry Eva and the children." "Does she know how to use a shotgun?" John asked with a cocked brow. "No," Samuel sighed. "I should have taught her by now." "Tomorrow isn't too late," John pointed out. "We'll manage without you." Samuel nodded before he headed back into the house. "Something wrong?" Eva asked, with concern in her gaze. Samuel shook his head. "No, ain't nothing but a heifer struggling with her first calf. John will take care of it." "Oh, I hope she's all right," Eva sympathized. "Good night, Samuel. Sleep well." Samuel watched his wife head towards the room she shared with her daughter and felt that pit in his stomach grow. He hated lying to Eva, but telling her the truth wouldn't only scare her, It would terrify the kids. For now, all he could do was be prepared and pray that the rustlers didn't find their way to his ranch. Not again. Chapter 13, 28th of May, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Samuel, I have laundry to do, and Mark is falling behind with his reading. Can't we practice shooting some more tomorrow? Eva asked when Samuel returned after lunch with his shotgun and ammunition. It won't take long, and the sooner you get used to the noise and the gun, the better. You did well the other day, given that it was the first time you have handled a gun, but you've got some things to learn yet. Samuel shrugged. Eva searched his gaze and couldn't help but feel there was something he wasn't telling her. He hadn't even mentioned owning weapons until 3 days ago, and now he was intent on teaching her how to use them. What about the children? They can't go with. I'll take them down to the barn. They can spend some time with their ponies and help John around the barn. Caring for their animals is just as important as reading, Samuel pointed out. Eva couldn't argue with that. She finally nodded. All right, you take the children down to the barn and I'll finish up here. A short while later, Samuel returned without the children. Ready? Ready as I'll ever be, Eva shrugged. She followed him to a tall tree at the side of the hill. He lined up some cans before explaining to Eva how to check if the gun was safe. Eva paid close attention to how to insert the ammunition and how to take aim. She pulled the trigger and her heart skipped a beat at the loud noise. It's so loud, Eva complained, having missed the tin. The more you shoot, the more used to it you'll get. Now go on, reload, and try for a tin this time, Samuel encouraged her. For the next 2 hours, Eva reloaded the weapon multiple times. Every time she missed, she could see the disappointment in Samuel's eyes. Finally, she became used to the noise and the scent of gunpowder. Samuel handed her a revolver and loaded up the entire chamber. There, now you've got 6 shots to work with. See how quickly you can empty the chamber. Eva took the revolver from him and aimed for the first can. When she heard the sound of metal slamming into metal, she aimed for the second can. Again, the shot rang true. She continued on to the other tins until her chamber was empty. By the time she had shot 6 times, there were 6 tins knocked over against the hill. She turned to Samuel with a triumphant grin. I like this one. Samuel's mouth hung open in shock. You. Clearly that's your weapon of choice. Eva laughed. If I had to choose one, then yes, this would be it. It's lighter and more manageable, and I don't have to reload every time like I do with the other one. Samuel, John cried out, running towards them. Samuel and Eva turned to see him rushing in their direction. He had Henry on his hip and held Mark's hand as he breathlessly closed the distance between them. John, what's wrong? Where's Carla? Samuel asked with a frown. I don't know, John said, shaking his head. She was there 1 minute, and the next minute she was gone. They were brushing down their ponies. We've searched everywhere. John's voice was filled with emotion. What do you mean she's gone? She can't be gone. She's a little girl. Eva panicked, stepping forward, hysteria lacing her voice. I don't know, ma'am. John sighed heavily. The boy says she wanted to take her pony for a walk. I just went into the barn to fetch the lead, thinking that I'll have her walk the horse in the ring. But when I came out, she and the pony were gone. Samuel, Eva cried out in panic. She's only a little girl. She can't be out on the ranch alone. Eva frowned as she saw a look pass between John and Samuel. What is it you're not telling me? Eva demanded with her hands on her hips. You gotta tell her, Samuel, John prompted quietly. Samuel turned to Eva and reached for her shoulders. There's been word about cattle rustlers in the area. They're mean and they're dangerous, and they won't hesitate to get rid of anything standing in their way. What do you mean by cattle rustlers? Eva asked, struggling to think straight. Thieves, Ma, Mark shouted impatiently. Men who steal cattle and then shoot anyone that can say it was them. Carla, Eva's voice trailed off before the world became dark. Eva, wake up, honey. Samuel's voice coaxed her out of the darkness. Her eyes fluttered open. What happened? You fainted, honey. Come on, let me help you sit up, Samuel offered. Eva pushed herself up until she was sitting. Carla, what are we going to do? We're going to find her, Samuel promised. I need you to stay here and take care of the children while John and I get the other hands and start searching. Look, Ma, it's Carla's horse. Hey, Eli, Mark called out as the horse trotted towards them. Eva's fear doubled in that moment. The pony nickered as he reached them, but there was no sight of Carla. Go find my daughter, Samuel, please. I beg of you, Eva pleaded, turning to Samuel. Samuel nodded. I will do everything I can to bring her back. Samuel promised before he leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss onto Eva's forehead. Eva didn't even notice the significance of the moment. All she could do was fear for her daughter. She couldn't imagine why cattle rustlers would hurt a little girl. But if they were as mean and ruthless as Samuel believed, Eva knew she wouldn't rest until Carla was returned home safe. Chapter 14. Eva's foot bobbed up and down persistently. She couldn't just sit quietly and hope her daughter was found. She felt powerless and useless, knowing that Carla was somewhere out there in the wilderness, and she wasn't doing anything to help find her. Henry was down for his afternoon nap, and beside her, Mark kept scanning the horizon for any sign of his sister. It was clear that Mark was just as restless as she was. It had been 2 hours since John had come to tell them that Carla was missing. 2 hours of her baby girl being alone on the ranch. Eva trusted Samuel and his men, but she couldn't sit by and do nothing. She couldn't be the obedient wife, waiting for the men to save the day. With every minute that passed, she became more and more worked up. Ma, do you think she got hurt? Mark asked, sensing her worry. Eva turned to Mark and knew that she should probably lie to her son. But it was clear he was just as concerned for his sister's safety. For so long, Mark had tried to protect her, but now it was her turn to protect him. But was she protecting him by lying to him? Eva considered that for a moment before she decided against it. I'm not sure, Mark. She could very well be. Mark gulped, tears shining in his eyes, which were filled with fear. That's it, Eva said, standing up. I'm fetching Henry, and we're going to go out and search for her. Mark nodded and tugged at his waistband. That's a good plan, Ma. I'll fetch my hat. Barely a few minutes later, Eva held a sleeping Henry on her shoulder as she and Mark set off to search for Carla. She had loaded the revolver and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, hoping that she wouldn't need it. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon as they walked, but that didn't deter Eva one bit. Until her daughter was found, she wouldn't rest. She just hoped that she had enough strength to carry Henry and that Mark would be able to keep up. Which way do you think she went? Eva asked Mark as she glanced out over the ranch. Mark shrugged. The tree line, I think, or it could have been the hills in the distance. She always talks about both. Mark stopped and a tear slipped over his cheek. Ma, it's my fault. I should have kept an eye on her. Eva stooped and kneeled in front of her son. It's not your job to keep an eye on your sister. Your sister shouldn't have taken off without permission. It's not your fault, do you hear me? Mark nodded, although Eva could see he didn't entirely believe her. Come on, let's keep going. It would be best to find her before the storm breaks, Eva said, picking up the pace. Henry was becoming heavier with each step, but Eva didn't dare set him down. Henry loved to run, and she didn't have time to run after him while she was searching for her daughter. Samuel, look at this, John pointed out as he stopped his horse beside a fence. He dismounted and crouched on the ground. Samuel pulled on the reins and slid out of the saddle. They had been riding for the last 3 hours without a single glimpse of Carla. Samuel doubted she would have come out this far, but they weren't going to take any chances. Did you find tracks? Samuel asked, moving towards John. John shook his head. Yeah, but not the tracks we're hoping for. Samuel felt his heart clench with fear as he kneeled beside John. They're here. Judging by these tracks, 15, maybe 20 of them, John said, pointing to the trail. Samuel stood up and kicked at the sand. We've got to find her, John. We will. John nodded in agreement. He touched Samuel's shoulder and held his gaze. We'll find her, Samuel, and then we'll let the sheriff know about this trail. If it's not too late, Samuel said heavily. Come on, let's keep searching, John said as he heaved himself into the saddle. Samuel hated feeling vulnerable. He hated that he allowed the presence of cattle rustlers to make him feel this way. He loved ranching, he loved his cattle, and he loved the land. But the mere thought of cattle rustlers on his property made him want to sell up and move back east. Samuel, come on, John repeated. Samuel nodded and hopped into his saddle. This time he didn't urge the horse into a slow trot. Instead, he slapped the reins until the wind tugged at his hair as the horse fled through the range in a full gallop. In the back of his mind, he knew he wouldn't be able to find Carla's tracks at this speed, but something was pushing him to go further, to cover more ground faster. He couldn't lose Carla. If he lost Carla, he would lose Eva. Although he and Eva hadn't spoken of feelings or their relationship much, the mere thought of losing her made his heart stop. He couldn't let the cattle rustlers win. Not this time. Chapter 15. The sun had stopped above them for a few minutes, burning down on the land before it began its slow descent to the other side of the horizon. Eva's arms were tired, and her back ached from carrying Henry's weight for the last 2 hours, but she didn't dare stop. Together, she and Mark had walked all the way down to the barn before heading towards the tree line. Without any tracks to go on, they had finally given up and headed in the other direction towards the hills. In the back of her mind, she thought of snakes, coyotes, bears, and wolves, all predators that roamed these fields, all predators that could attack them at any moment. But she didn't allow that to deter her from her goal, finding Carla. She hadn't seen Samuel or his hands since they had left the ranch, and although Eva knew that they too were searching for her daughter, she couldn't help but feel discouraged that they hadn't returned yet, because that meant they hadn't found Carla either. "Ma, my feet hurt," Mark complained beside her as they reached the hills. Eva nodded and set Henry down. "You stay here, Henry," she said firmly to the toddler. As if sensing that this wasn't the time to push boundaries, Henry stood in one place while Eva sat down on a large rock. "What if we don't find her, Ma?" Mark asked, sitting down beside her. Eva bit back the tears. "We'll find her. Sooner or later, we'll find her." They sat for a few moments to rest. Eva knew that if her legs were hurting, her feet aching, and her back protesting from all the walking with Henry on her hip, Mark ought to be exhausted as well. As much as she wanted to continue searching, she needed to be responsible. She couldn't keep up for much longer, and neither could Mark. Eva closed her eyes and began to pray. She didn't know what else to do. "Dear Lord, please give me strength. Lord, I cannot lose Carla. Not like this. Please guide me to her. Help us find her and bring her home safely. I know she is under your protection, Lord, but I still fear for her life with the cattle rustlers that Samuel had mentioned. Please, Lord, keep my baby girl safe and lead me to where I will find her. I beg of you, Lord, give me the faith and the energy to keep searching until I have her in my arms once more. Amen. Tell you what, why don't we head home, have some food and some drink, and then we'll start searching again?" Mark frowned. "I'm thirsty." Eva nodded, feeling guilty. She hadn't even thought to pack some water. "All right, come on." Knowing the path from the hills back to the barn, Eva headed in that direction. This time she didn't carry Henry. Instead, she walked first. Mark held up the back, and she told Henry to stay between them. Henry, for once, didn't run off, following her as if he understood that now wasn't the time to be unruly. They had almost reached the barn when Henry asked to be picked up. Eva's arms and her back protested, but she scooped the toddler into her arms as they neared the barn. When they finally reached it, Eva stopped at the water well and pumped some water to ease their thirst. Mark drank deeply, making Eva feel even more guilty for not having given him something to drink sooner. Even Henry, who hadn't even walked all that far, eagerly lapped at the water that Eva offered in her cupped hands. She was the last to drink, welcoming the cool moisture to her dry throat. Once they had eased their thirsts, Eva dragged a hand through her wind-blown hair. "Where were you when you noticed she was gone?" Eva asked Mark. Mark pointed to the posts in front of the barn. "There, the horses were standing at the posts. I was standing there and the horses were between us. That's probably why I didn't see her head out." "It's all right, Mark." "It's not your fault," Eva insisted. Eva's throat was dry and sore from crying out Carla's name over the last couple of hours, but she did so once more. "Carla! Carla! Where are you?" She heard a muffled noise coming from inside the barn, and her heart stopped. "Mama, Henry hungry," Henry cried out impatiently. Eva shook her head. "Henry, hush! Carla, Carla, can you hear me?" Again, she heard the muffled noise from inside the barn. Eva grabbed Henry and headed into the barn. The scent of horses, hay, and feed filled the air. It was dark and musty inside the barn, but Eva walked right in. "Carla? Ma?" Carla's voice was a little more than a whimper. "Mark, take your brother," Eva said firmly, setting Henry down on the ground before she ascended the ladder into the hayloft. As soon as her gaze reached the hayloft, she spotted Carla sitting in the far corner, her eyes swollen from crying. "Oh, my baby," Eva said, rushing towards her. She fell down beside her daughter and held her close while they both wept with relief at having been reunited. "I was so worried," Eva admitted as she sprinkled kisses all over Carla's face. "I'm sorry, Ma," Carla sniffed. "What happened, baby girl?" Eva asked, reaching for a handkerchief to wipe her daughter's face. "I was brushing down my pony when it tugged free and ran towards the trees. I was afraid I'd be in trouble for letting him go, so I went after him," Carla explained. "But he was too fast." "You've been gone for hours?" Eva asked with a curious look. "I didn't know what to do. I waited for my horse to come back, but he didn't. Then I got lost," Carla admitted. "I kept walking until I could see the barn. And then," Eva prodded, "I went back to the house, but no one was there. Then I came to the barn, but everyone was gone." "Oh, you poor thing," Eva pulled her in close. That's why Samuel had told her to stay home. If only she had listened, she wouldn't have dragged Henry and Mark all over the ranch, and poor Carla wouldn't have been sitting up here in the hayloft all alone. "You're safe now. Mommy's got you." "I'm hungry." Henry's voice came from the barn below. Eva couldn't help but laugh. "I bet you're hungry too, eh?" Carla nodded. Together they stood up, and Eva gave her daughter one last hug. "Don't ever scare me like that again. Your horse found his way home long before you did. Promise me you'll never go after him again?" "I won't, Mommy. I was afraid," Carla admitted. "Good. Now let's get you home," Eva said the words as relief flooded her. She had no way of getting word to Samuel and his ranch hands, but as soon as they returned, she would tell them the good news. Eva walked home with all three children, feeling the weight of the day disappear off her shoulders. Carla told Mark about her adventures on the range while Henry ran ahead. Eva had never been more grateful for miracles than at that moment. She knew of all the dangers that could have threatened her daughter's life, but God had protected her daughter, just like she knew God would protect Samuel and his men against the cattle ranchers. Chapter 16. After a scare like the one she'd just suffered, a mother needed to mother. Eva wished there was a way for her to send word that Carla had been found, safe and sound. But since she couldn't, she focused on reassuring herself that her children were safe. She made them sandwiches, while she hummed to herself all the while. After they had appeased their hunger and their thirst, Eva gathered her children in the living room and retrieved a book saved for special occasions. She leafed through the pages until she found the perfect story. The large leather-bound storybook was one that Peter had bought for the children before he passed away. Because the script was so small, it was often hard to read stories by candlelight. But with the late afternoon light filtering through the window, Eva had no trouble reading the small script at all. It wasn't long before Henry and Mark were both sound asleep. Eva considered trying to keep them awake, but she was emotionally exhausted after a terrifying few hours, and likewise her sons were physically exhausted after the search. With her brothers fast asleep, Carla moved closer and settled her head on Eva's lap as she listened to the story. Eva smiled and bit back tears of gratitude and contentment as she continued to read. There had been a few moments today when she hadn't thought she would ever have the privilege of holding her daughter again, and yet here she was, perfectly safe. When the story finally came to an end, Eva heard a rider approach the house. "Wait here, I'll be right back." Eva rushed to the door and quickly explained that Carla had been found. The ranch hand was just as relieved as Eva had been to find her. He rode off immediately to let Samuel and the others know. Carla joined her on the porch with a curious look. "Is everyone out looking for me?" Eva nodded. Everyone. Samuel sent out all the ranch hands to search for you. We were all very worried. Carla guilty looked at her feet. I'm sorry for making such a fuss, Ma. It's all right, honey. I'm just glad you're safe. Can we make some of your sugar cookies? That way we can give them some when they get back. To say thank you? Carla asked, hopefully. The last thing Eva was in the mood for was baking, but her daughter had a point. They needed to thank all the men who had put their work on hold to help find Carla. That's a great idea. Together, mother and daughter measured, mixed, and baked for the next hour. By the time they were done, flour, sugar, and crumbs covered the surfaces of the kitchen, but Eva didn't mind. The scent of sweet, buttery cookies hung in the air, making even Eva's mouth water. She had baked this recipe so many times in the past, but from today, it would have special meaning. It would be something she and Carla did together, their special quality time. As if reading her mind, Carla turned to her with a smile. It's nice when it's just the two of us baking. Eva nodded. It is nice. Eva heard the hooves of a group of horses with their riders even before she saw the riders approach from the distance. For a moment, her heart skipped a beat, thinking it was the cattle rustlers that Samuel had warned her about. But as soon as they came into sight, Eva recognized John and the ranch hands. She retrieved the last sheet of cookies from the oven and set them on the cooling tray. You bring out the tray of cool cookies, and I'll take this out. Eva picked up the tray with iced tea and glasses and headed out onto the porch to thank and welcome the ranch hands. You shouldn't spoil us like this, ma'am. Heck, it's good to see you, girl, John said, smiling at Carla. Eva nodded. Carla wanted to thank everyone for their trouble. I didn't realize you were so many. It's a deal. When I heard you riding up, I thought for a moment you might be the cattle rustlers. John shook his head. They won't be back. After we received word that Carla was safe, we sent for the sheriff. We tracked down the rustlers where they were hiding out in the woods. With the sheriff's help, we've run them out of our territory, and they won't be back. If it hadn't been for Carla disappearing today, we might not have known how close they were. So it's because of me that you could chase them away? Carla asked hopefully. Yep, little miss. The sheriff went after them with a posse of men from town, and they've sent word for some rangers to join the hunt. Them rustlers will be running for a long time unless they're caught. That is good news, Eva agreed with a smile of relief. Carla walked through the group of men and offered them freshly baked cookies, while Mark made his own rounds, in the hopes of hearing some more exciting stories about the cattle rustlers. A young ranch hand, not yet 20, had scooped a barely awake Henry off the porch and was twirling him in the air, teasing giggles from him. Eva stood and observed the scene around her. None of these men were family, not even distantly related, and yet working together on Samuel's ranch had made them a kind of family unit. You could see how they looked out for each other, although they didn't always like one another, very much like a real family. They embraced her children with the same kindness and familiarity as John, as if they too were now part of this ranch's family unit. Grateful the day had such a good ending, Eva scanned the gathering of men for a sight of Samuel. When she couldn't see him, she began to move through the 10 or so men that were gathered in her yard. Every few steps she was stopped and thanked for the cookies and iced tea. But she had yet to find Samuel. Although he hardly talked to her, and when he did it was awkward, Eva wanted to thank him for taking such trouble of sending his men out in search of her daughter. Chapter 17. Eva began to gather the glasses from the porch as the ranch hands began to leave one by one. All in all, it had turned out to be a victorious day. Not only was Carla home safe and sound, but the cattle rustlers that seemed to cause nothing but trouble were being tracked by the authorities. The cookies had been a hit among the men, just like her children, she thought, as Mark practiced his throw with one of the hands. Henry was toddling around the yard, exploring under the watchful eye of 2 men who were talking close by. And yet Eva had yet to see Samuel. As time passed, she couldn't help but fear that Samuel had joined the sheriff and his men to track down the rustlers. She might not understand her husband or even be in love with him, but Eva realized that she did care for him. Deeply. She tried to push her concerns to the back of her mind and keep up a jolly front as some of the men lingered behind. Needing a moment to herself, Eva retreated to the kitchen and began to rinse the dishes. Carla had taken it upon herself to make sandwiches for the remaining few. Eva winced when she saw what her daughter put on the bread, hoping the men would be as receptive to the sandwiches as they were to the cookies. Although Eva doubted peanut butter and tomato sandwiches would go down as well. "Ma, don't these look like them fancy sandwiches the rich people have in New York?" Carla asked, slicing the sandwiches roughly into small triangles with a blunt knife. Eva nodded, not wanting to break her daughter's heart by telling her they were nothing like it at all in reality. When all the dishes were rinsed, Eva no longer had an excuse to hide inside, while her children were entertained by a few of the ranch hands outside. She headed to the porch and took a seat on the rocker, wondering if Samuel was safe. John, the head ranch hand, walked up and joined her. "It's nice to have them young ones around, lifts the spirits," John said, nodding towards the men as they played with the children. Eva smiled in agreement. "It's nice for the children as well. It's almost like a second family." John chuckled. "Friends are the family you choose for yourself. That's something we hands believe. We don't often get to stay home with our families, so in a way, the hands working with you become your second family." Eva nodded. "I've noticed." Her eyes scanned the range for a sight of Samuel, but she couldn't seem to spot him anywhere. "Did Samuel go with the sheriff?" Eva finally asked the question she already knew the answer to. John frowned and shook his head before he turned towards her. "No, why would he do that?" "I don't know, well, he's not here." Eva trailed off. John searched Eva's eyes with curious interest. "You don't know, do you?" Eva shrugged. "Know what?" "Nah, it's best Samuel tells you himself. He's up on the hill behind the house," John explained. "Why would he be on the hill and not here with the rest of you?" Eva asked, confused. John thought for a moment before he finally answered. "Because he goes to the cemetery alone. The family cemetery is on the hill." "There is a family cemetery?" Eva asked, shaking her head. Why did it feel like there was too much she didn't know? "Yes, ma'am," John nodded. "If you want to go after him, we'll look after the young ones." Eva's eyes widened with fear, making John chuckle. "Don't worry, I won't take my eyes off them, especially Carla. Go on, I can see you want to." Eva considered for a moment. She knew it wasn't John's fault that Carla had gone off on her own, but if he'd kept a closer watch. But then she needed to forgive him. She knew how stubborn her daughter could be. "All right, but please, John, don't let them out of your sight." John nodded. "I swear, you'll find the path a little ways from the laundry line. You just follow that path all the way up, and you'll see it." Eva didn't hesitate. She grabbed a shawl from inside the house before leaving through the back door. When she found the path, she wondered why she hadn't noticed it before. She wasn't sure if Samuel wanted to be found, but Eva started along the path, needing a few answers from her husband. The first question she had to ask was why he hadn't bothered to tell her about the cemetery in the first place. Chapter 18. Eva reached the top of the hill slightly breathless. The sun was sinking below the horizon, coloring the sky in beautiful hues of orange and pink. The view from the top of the hill was nothing short of amazing, she thought as she caught her breath. She could see the entire ranch, from the trees to the hills and even the barn and the cabin in the distance. Below her, she could see her children playing with the ranch hands, and John standing on the porch, keeping a watchful eye. Although she appreciated the view, Eva remembered her reason for climbing the hill in the first place. She turned, and in the distance, she saw an old spruce tree, with a man sitting underneath it. Samuel. Without hesitation, Eva started towards him. As she closed the distance between them, Eva noticed 3 crosses a few feet from where Samuel was sitting. The crosses had a fresh coat of white paint on them, as if they were being cared for and were not forgotten. Samuel looked up and met her gaze when she was close. For a moment, Eva knew she was crossing some invisible line. A line Samuel had drawn in the sand between them, perhaps the same line that made it impossible for Eva to understand him. She didn't speak. Instead, she moved toward him and took a seat beside him. Samuel didn't tell her to leave, but nor did he welcome her presence. Eva felt the heaviness of sorrow and grief emanating from Samuel. She glanced at him and could see the sorrow in his eyes. Not wanting to probe, she turned and looked at the crosses. Her heart clenched in her chest as she read the markings. Lisa Marie Pugh, 1861-1890. Jack Samuel Pugh, 1886-1890. Rosie Pugh, 1888, top 1890. Eva didn't have to ask to know that this had been Samuel's family. The family he had before he met her. The family he had lost. His wife, his son, and his daughter, who had only been 2 years old at the time. A tear slipped over Eva's cheek, understanding how devastating the loss must have been for Samuel. She quietly wept for the family he had lost. Needing to express her sympathy in some way, she reached for Samuel's hand and held it as she wept. Eva wasn't sure how long they sat there or how long she wept, but she finally understood her husband a little better. Perhaps the distance she felt between them wasn't due to his lack of feelings for her, but because he had lost so much that he was afraid of feeling again. Today was a hard day for me. When Samuel spoke, Eva turned to him, eager to hear what he had to say. She didn't ask him to explain. Instead, she waited for him to continue. It reminded me of the day I lost them. All of them. Samuel's voice broke as he spoke. That day started like just another normal day on the range. John came to tell me that there were signs of cattle rustlers on the property late that morning. Prepared to chase them off, we set off to find them and run them off the property. Samuel sighed and shook his head. It was warm and the children were playing in the yard, while Lisa Marie hung out the laundry. They had no idea about the cattle rustlers, or that the men were armed and seeking revenge for being chased off from the herd. Oh, Samuel. Eva closed her eyes, not wanting to hear about the misery he had suffered, but unable to stop him. When we returned later that afternoon, it was too late. I managed to protect my cattle, but I lost my family. If I'd known, I would have given them the whole darn herd. Samuel squeezed her hand for support. I'm so sorry, Samuel. I can't imagine how horrible it must have been, Eva sympathized. Samuel nodded. Even worse. He shook his head and drew in a deep breath. This morning, I was afraid it would happen again. I wanted nothing more than to get back to you and the children, but I knew if I didn't find Carla, I feared they would find her first. She's safe now. We're all safe, Eva said, resting her head on Samuel's shoulder. Her heart swelled with love for the man beside her. Although he hardly showed her any affection at all, she couldn't blame him. Samuel had suffered the worst loss any man could imagine. He had buried his wife and his children. He had buried his dreams of the future. She lifted her head and met his gaze. You're the bravest man I know, Samuel Pugh. Eva meant every single word. Chapter 19. Samuel savored the feel of Eva sitting beside him. It felt right to have her here with him. It felt right to hold her hand in his. When she spoke, he frowned and met her gaze with a baffled expression. Brave, you must be mistaking me for someone else? Eva shook her head, her eyes warm and filled with kindness. After losing so much, you were brave enough to want a family again. You were brave enough to dream of a future again. That, for me, is the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. Samuel shrugged, but deep down he appreciated her observation. He hadn't thought of himself as brave. He'd only thought of himself as lonely. 2 years after he lost his family, he had known that he would either succumb to a life of loneliness and grief, or he could at least try to find joy again. Love, he wasn't sure he would ever allow himself that again. When you lost so much and knew how much it hurt, you were careful to open your heart to love again, especially if you knew that if you did, it would rush over you like a flood, and you would be unable to stop the feelings that would come with it. You're brave, too, Samuel said, smiling down at Eva. You braved a train journey across the country with hopes for a new future. Your children are very lucky to have such a brave woman to call their ma. Eva chuckled and shook her head. Look at the pair of us, brave and yet too afraid to love again. Samuel nodded. It's easy the first time, the excitement, the hope for the future. It fools you into opening your heart without hesitation. But once you suffered loss, you're more cautious. Few people understand that, Eva agreed. I was beginning to think you didn't want us here. You're always so distant, and with me, it's as if you avoid me. Samuel sighed heavily and squeezed her hand. Having you here has given me new hope. It's hard, I won't lie, because you and the children, you remind me of what I lost. But at the same time, you give me hope for the future. If I've been distant, it's simply because I'm afraid of losing you, all of you. Eva sat up and met his gaze. I'm afraid of being widowed again, but I can't let that keep me from looking for a future for my children. I think that instead of being afraid of what might happen, we need to cherish what we have, knowing that anything could happen. Samuel thought for a moment before his mouth curved into a smile. Not only are you beautiful, hardworking, and kind, but you're wise too. Eva's eyes softened as a smile curved her mouth. I think that's the first time you've looked me in the eye and said something nice to me. It's nice. Samuel chuckled. Good to know. For a while, they were both quiet until Samuel finally spoke again. When I saw you coming up the hill, I wasn't sure if I wanted you here. Ever since the funeral, I've always come here alone. Now I'm glad you came. Why didn't you tell me about them? Eva asked with a frown. Samuel shrugged. Because it's my burden to carry. Perhaps because I thought if you knew, you wouldn't stay. Samuel hadn't been this honest with himself or a woman since he'd lost Lisa Marie. Eva nodded as if digesting his words. After a few moments of silence, she finally spoke. I know our marriage is more one of convenience than love, but we did say our vows, Samuel. A burden for you is a burden I want to help carry. I too am afraid of loving again, but we can support each other without falling in love. We can be there for each other and help each other through difficult days, regardless of our unconventional marriage. I'd like to support you. I'd like to know about Lisa Marie and your children. Samuel felt a stab right through the center of his heart. For a moment, he thought he had reached the end of his life until his heart was flooded with warmth. It was as if the barriers he had built to protect himself from the grief were crumbling with the warmth of Eva's kind words. He held her gaze and smiled. Thank you, Eva. I'd like to know more about your Peter as well one day. Eva nodded with a small smile. We can share in the future, and in the past, we can be friends. Samuel nodded. I would like that. I'd like that very much. They sat for a while longer, having shared difficult truths. Not only did Samuel feel as if there was indeed hope for the future, he felt hopeful that perhaps Eva could be more than just someone that cooked for him and cleaned his house. Perhaps in time she could indeed become a friend, one in whom he could confide, one he could trust to share his burdens. Twilight had fallen over the range, and although Samuel would have enjoyed sitting there for longer, he knew Eva would want to return to her children. Just as it had been a difficult day for him, it had been a difficult day for Eva. She needed to spend time with her children. She needed to bathe them with love and kisses and be assured that all her chicks were safely tucked into the nest tonight. He stood up and held out his hand to Eva. Come on, let's go home. Eva accepted his hand, and Samuel was surprised at how nice it was to feel her touch. They began walking down the hill, and he didn't let it go. Instead, he savored the feeling of knowing that he was no longer alone. Not in his sorrow, not in the house where tragedy had befallen him, and he wasn't looking towards the future alone. Moving back to the ranch house had been difficult, more difficult than he had imagined. Ever since the day he had found his family murdered by the cattle rustlers, he hadn't once returned. For him, the ranch house symbolized heartache and loss. But as the light of the lanterns on the porch came into view, Samuel realized that the house no longer brought him grief. Instead, it was as if the soft lighting invited him toward his future. He stopped at the bottom of the hill and turned to Eva with a curious smile. Thank you for coming to find me. Eva smiled and shrugged. I thought you were avoiding us. I was prepared to pack our bags and take the next train back to New York. Samuel's eyes widened even as his heart stopped. Promise me you'll never do that. Please, Eva, promise me. Eva frowned. For someone who hasn't made me feel very welcome or wanted, you sure seem persistent. Samuel sighed and shook his head. I'll do better. Just promise me you'll stay. You and your children. You've become everything to me. Tears shone in Eva's gaze as she nodded. Those words mean everything to me. Samuel squeezed her hand, knowing they had turned over a new leaf. Chapter 20, 15 June 1892, Oak Creek, Montana, and they lived happily ever after. Eva finished the story and closed the book. Carla and Mark sat upright with wide eyes. Carla was the first to start the barrage of questions that usually followed their nighttime story. And the dwarfs? Did they live happily ever after too? Yes, Snow White and the dwarfs remained friends for many, many years, Eva improvised. Samuel is our stepfather, right, Ma? Mark asked with a frown. Eva nodded. Yes, he is, but he's not evil. Carla's nose scrunched up, making her look adorable. No, he isn't evil. He's very kind. Eva nodded. Can we call him Pa? Mark asked, taking the wind out of Eva's sails. Do you want to call him Pa? Eva asked, treading carefully in this unknown territory. Yes, Carla exclaimed. He does everything a pa does. He plays with us. He bought us horses, and he teaches us to do things. Isn't that what a pa does? Yes, I suppose. Eva sounded uncertain even to her own ears. I'll ask him. Thanks, Ma, Mark said, as if the matter had been settled. Henry's already asleep. Yes, and you should be too. Eva stood up and tucked Mark in before she turned to Carla. Come on, Carla. Off to bed. Once she had tucked Carla in and showered her with kisses, Eva closed the bedroom and let out a quiet sigh of contentment. The fact that her children wanted to call Samuel Pa meant that they trusted him, perhaps even loved him. It warmed her heart to know that Samuel was so good to her children. He had even changed towards her over the last couple of weeks. Although he still seemed distant and awkward now and then, the distance between them didn't seem as unbreachable as it had before the day at the cemetery. She headed to the kitchen to check on Samuel before she turned in. But instead of sitting in the living room where he usually spent his evenings, Samuel was in the kitchen. Do you need anything before I turn in? Eva asked curiously. Samuel turned to her with a smile. Actually, I thought you might join me for a cup of coffee on the porch. It's a lovely evening out. Eva frowned, surprised by his invitation. If you're sure. I am, here. I took the liberty of already making you coffee, although I don't even know if you take sugar. I do, Eva said, surprised by his effort. She watched as he added a generous spoon of sugar before stirring the coffee. Armed with their coffee, they headed out to the porch. It felt strange to sit on the porch with Samuel. Usually they were only in each other's company when the children were there to act as a buffer. She could hear the cicadas and night sounds of the range, and Samuel's breathing beside her as she held the cup of coffee in her hands. For a while, they both sat in silence until Eva remembered Mark's question. Mark asked me an interesting question before I tucked him in. Yeah? Samuel asked, turning to her. He wanted to know if they could call you Pa? Eva watched Samuel's expression carefully to see his reaction. His face burst into an expression of joy, even as his mouth curved with a smile. They want to call me Pa? Laughter bubbled from Eva's throat. She couldn't remember ever seeing Samuel this excited. Yes, if you don't mind. I don't mind at all. Those kids, you've raised wonderful children, Eva, Samuel complimented her and reached for her hand. Eva's heart skipped a beat at his touch. It was as if matters were slowly starting to change between them, as if the boundaries that had been there from the start were starting to ease away. I'll tell them. I'm sure they will be pleased, Eva said with a smile. I thought, perhaps we might do this every night, Samuel said, holding her gaze. Have coffee together before we go to bed. Of course it can be tea or water or anything really, but to spend a little time without the children? Samuel seemed uncertain of his words, as if he had trouble expressing himself. Eva knew she shouldn't tease him, but she couldn't resist. Samuel, are you saying you want to spend more time with me? Samuel huffed impatiently. You know what I mean. This time it was Eva who reached for his hand. I'd like that very much. They shared a smile, as if they had just crossed a rickety bridge and survived. They didn't talk much after that, but they did watch the stars in companionable silence. Chapter 21, 15th of August, 1892, Oak Creek, Montana. Ma, I don't like them beans. Please don't make me eat them, Mark complained, pushing the beans around on his plate. Carla, trying her best to win over her mother's favor, took a big mouthful. I love them beans. Carla, don't talk with food in your mouth. Mark, you'll eat your beans or you won't get more potatoes. Eva waged the dinner war while feeding Henry. Samuel hadn't returned from riding fences yet, but it wasn't out of the ordinary for him to return late these days. It was the last weeks of summer, and Eva understood that there was more work to do on the ranch at this time of year. Through their evenings on the porch, Eva had come to learn more about the ranch and raising cattle. It helped her understand her husband's schedule and the long days that he endured at this time of year. When Eva heard horse hooves approach the house, her heart skipped a familiar beat. She had vowed that she wouldn't open her heart to love again, but over the last 2 months, she had found herself falling in love with Samuel. She knew that he didn't feel the same and had accepted that, but deep down she couldn't help but yearn for the loving relationship of a real husband and wife. Samuel had really made an effort to make her feel appreciated and wanted on the ranch. He had made even more of an effort to earn his place as pa from her children. But when it came to her, Samuel still held a safe distance. They would talk for hours, but it was as if Samuel was afraid to let her come too close, as if letting her into his heart would tarnish the memory of the wife and the children he had lost. Eva understood that and wouldn't rush him. Instead, she hoped that if she was patient enough, in time Samuel too would allow himself to look at her in the way she looked at him, with admiration, love, and respect. Boots thudded on the porch, and Eva counted the seconds until Samuel would open the door and greet them. But instead of Samuel's voice, it was John's voice that called out. "Evening, ma'am, young ones," John said with his hat in his hand. Eva's heart skipped a beat. "John, is something wrong? Where is Samuel? Did something happen?" John shook his head. "Not at all, ma'am." John held a lantern out to Eva. "He asked you to meet him on the hill. I'll take care of this lot. I'll even tell them a bedtime story." "One about cowboys and Indians?" Mark asked hopefully. "Why?" Eva asked, confused. "Not sure, ma'am. He just asked to bring you the message," John said before he turned to Mark. "Sure, but you got to finish your dinner first." Eva wondered why Samuel would want her to join him in the cemetery this close to bedtime, but she wouldn't know if she didn't go. She glanced at her children and noticed that Mark was now eating his beans as if he had an appetite for more. She turned to John with a stern look. "No violence." "Yes, ma'am." John nodded before taking a seat at the table. Eva took the lantern and headed around the ranch house. A frown creased her brow when she noticed a trail of lanterns heading up the hill to light her way. Surprised and charmed by Samuel's efforts, she followed the path easily right to the top. Samuel was waiting for her beneath the tree. Beside him was a makeshift table with 2 chairs. A lantern stood on the center of the table, along with 2 glasses of what Eva presumed was wine. A smile curved her mouth as she walked towards him. "What is this?" Samuel shrugged with a small smile. "Dinner with a view?" Eva laughed as she noticed the grilled steak and beans on the plates. "That's very inventive of you." Samuel pulled out the chair for her, and Eva sat down. She wasn't sure why Samuel had gone to all this trouble, but she felt thoroughly charmed. "I have a few things I need to say to you, Eva. I wanted to do it right, so please just bear with me," Samuel said, letting out a sigh. "I'm not even sure where to start." Eva frowned and reached for his hand. "At the beginning, that's usually a good place to start." Samuel nodded and waited a few moments before he began to speak. "After I lost my family, I never wanted to have a family again. I vowed never to love or care for anyone again. I was happy with my decision, but the loneliness, the silence, it got to me. It was John who suggested I find a wife of convenience, one who would help out around the house, one who would fill the silence." Samuel sighed. "When you wrote to me, I thought you would be the perfect fit. As a widow, you didn't expect what I couldn't offer you." Eva frowned, curious about where this was going, but she didn't dare to interrupt him. "Those first few months, I felt lost, as if I had bitten off more than I could chew. Moving back to the ranch house had been hard. It was where I had lost everything dear to me, and then you came along and made it a home again. You filled it with laughter and warmth, and the children, it was impossible not to fall in love with them, Eva." "They love you too," Eva assured Samuel. "But with you, I didn't want to get too close." I didn't want you to know about my sorrows or what happened to my family. But once I told you, everything seemed to change. I didn't want to love again, but it was impossible not to fall in love with you." Eva gasped with surprise. "What did you just say?" Samuel chuckled and squeezed her hand. "I'm saying I didn't want to fall in love with you, but it seemed as if fate had other plans. Eva, I know we agreed that this would be a marriage of convenience, but I want more. I want a real marriage, Eva, because I love you." The stars began to spin above Eva's head. This was the last thing she had expected Samuel to say. Her eyes filled with tears as she searched his gaze. "Samuel, I love you too. I didn't think I would love again after Peter, but I do. I love you with all my heart." Samuel smiled with relief and a hopeful look. "Then let's start over. Let's forget about the arrangement. Let's make a new arrangement. One where I love you, you love me, and just like in the stories you tell the children, we live happily ever after." Eva nodded, unable to voice her emotions, which were too overwhelming. Samuel stood up and moved around the table. He kneeled in front of Eva and took her hand. "Eva, will you be my wife, my real wife?" Eva laughed as she nodded. "Yes, yes." Samuel framed her face and tenderly brushed a kiss over her lips. "I wanted to ask you here, because here where my sorrow lies, now lies my joy." He couldn't have worded it better if he had tried. Eva leaned into her husband and for the first time in years knew that everything would be all right. Not only because she was safe, but because she was loved, and because her daughter would finally have her own room. Epilogue. 18th of July, 1897, Oak Creek, Montana. "Where is she? How is she doing?" Samuel asked as he burst through the doors. "She's in her room with the midwife," Carla explained before she carried another bucket of hot water towards the hallway. "Pa, you need to calm down. She's done this before, you know," Mark said from the living room with a teasing look. Samuel shook his head. "Don't you try and sound clever. Do you know what your ma's going through?" "Pain." Henry shrugged from his seat. "She's been crying out with pain all afternoon." Samuel shook his head. "I should have been here. No one knew the babe was going to make an arrival today." "How did it go at the auction?" Mark asked. Samuel took off his hat and took a seat with his two sons in the living room, while Eva's cries of pain could be heard down the hallway. Both Henry and Mark had become avid riders and cattle herders. Although Henry was only 11 years old, Samuel knew that the boy held a lot of promise. As for Mark, there was no doubt in Samuel's mind that Mark would one day be a better rancher than even he was. Mark had become irreplaceable on the ranch. He was involved in every aspect of the ranch, even auctioning the cattle once a year. The only reason he hadn't come to the auction this year was because Samuel had feared that Eva would go into labor and he wouldn't be around. If it hadn't been for Mark staying behind, the midwife in town wouldn't have known to come out to help Eva with the birth. "It went well. Our cattle reached a fair price. Better than last year," Samuel said, trying to keep his mind off Eva's pain. Every time she cried out with pain, it was as if Samuel was suffering the pain with her. Although their marriage had been somewhat of an awkward arrangement at the beginning, they had grown to love and adore each other since. Samuel couldn't imagine his life with Eva, and she had become his everything. His entire world started and ended with her happiness. Neither of the two had ever expected to have more children, but when Eva had announced she was with child, Samuel had been overjoyed. They both knew the dangers, given Eva was older now than she had been with her other children, but the pregnancy had been problem-free, luckily. Samuel could only pray that the birth would be the same. Eva grew quiet, and Samuel felt his nerves being rubbed raw with fear that something had gone wrong. He held his breath unknowingly for a sound, any sound, to come from the room. "There!" Mark cried out and jumped up. "Did you hear?" Before Samuel or Henry could answer, the wails of a baby filled the air. Carla came rushing down the hallway and stopped in front of Samuel. "Do you want to meet your son?" Samuel felt overwhelmed with joy as he walked into the room. The midwife had made Eva respectable before she excused herself from the room. Carla handed him the baby before she excused herself as well. Samuel moved towards the bed and sat down on the edge. He's beautiful, Eva. He's strong." Eva laughed weakly. You're a father again, Samuel. And you a mother, Samuel said with his voice filled with emotion. He turned to Eva and reached for her hand. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, for loving me, and for bringing our beautiful baby boy into the world. Eva nodded as a tear slipped over her cheek. Thank the Lord for giving us both a second chance at happiness. He's blessed us, Samuel, many times over. Samuel nodded. They were blessed. We'll name him Asher, a blessing from God, just like one of Jacob's 12 sons. Asher Pugh, welcome to the family, Eva said, reaching for her son's tiny hand. When she met Samuel's gaze, he realized he no longer carried grief or doubt. Instead, his love was filled with love and contentment. He was blessed indeed.